A man no one had seen before walked into the Royal Canadian Legion on a Thursday evening in late October, ordered a Canadian club on the rocks, and within 10 minutes had the attention of half the room. Not because he was loud exactly, but because he had a way of taking up space that made it impossible to ignore him. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad across the shoulders, with a thick, dark beard going grey at the corners, and the kind of self-satisfied posture that belongs to men who've spent years being the most interesting person in whatever room they happen to occupy. He wore a canvas work jacket with a small poppy pinned above the breast pocket, which in a Legion Hall in November is not unusual. What was unusual was the metal ribbon bar stitched to the inside lapel, 3 ribbons, visible when the jacket fell open, displayed with the casual negligence of someone who wants you to notice without appearing to want you to notice. He sat at the bar and introduced himself to the man on the stool beside him as someone who had served. He said it the way men say it when they want the word to land with weight, served. He paused after it, let it settle, and then he ordered a second drink before the first was finished and began to talk. If you believe that the men and women who actually wore this country's uniform deserve to have their service protected, not just celebrated, but protected, type the word duty in the comments right now. Because what happened that Thursday night at Branch 291 in Kenora, Ontario, is a story about the difference between wearing a word and earning one. The Legion sat on a side street 2 blocks from Lake of the Woods, a modest 2-story building of pale brick with a parking lot in the rear and a flagpole out front that flew the Canadian flag above the branch standard, both lit by a single floodlight, whose bulb the branch president, a retired warrant officer named Ted Colhan, replaced himself every spring. Branch 291 was not a large legion. It served a small northern Ontario city of 20,000 people, a place where the winters were serious and the summers brief, and the relationship between the community and its veterans ran deeper than ceremony. It ran through families, through surnames on the cenotaph in Memorial Park that matched surnames on current membership cards, through the particular quiet that falls over a room of people who have buried friends younger than themselves. The main hall held a bar along the south wall, a dozen tables arranged without much ceremony, a small stage at the far end that was used for Remembrance Day services and the occasional dance, and a wall of photographs and unit crests and framed service records that ran the full length of the east side from floor to nearly the ceiling. The photographs were not arranged by conflict or by year. They were arranged the way memory arranges things, which is to say imperfectly, with gaps, with things out of order, with certain faces appearing in more than one frame, because certain men had served in more than one place, and their presence refused to be contained by a single image. The bartender was a woman named Cheryl Wozniak, 52 years old, with short dark hair and reading glasses she kept on a chain around her neck and almost never used for reading. She had managed the bar at Branch 291 for 14 years, and before that had spent 12 years as a military spouse, which is its own particular form of service that people in that room understood without needing to say. She knew the regulars by name and by drink, and by the particular silence each of them carried, which differed from person to person the way weather differs, recognizable as the same phenomenon but never quite the same twice. The old man had been coming to Branch 291 on Thursday evenings for as long as Cheryl could remember, which was longer than she had worked there, because the members who had been coming before her spoke of him as a fixture, the way they spoke of the photograph wall and the pool table with the slight wobble and the clock above the bar that ran 3 minutes fast, and that no one had corrected in 20 years. He arrived at the same time each week, 7 o'clock, sometimes a few minutes before, never after. He drove himself in a dark green half-ton with a cracked passenger side mirror that he had not replaced in at least 2 years, which Cheryl knew because she had noticed it the first winter, and it was still cracked now. He came through the door with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has been cold before and knows that rushing does not help. He wore a weathered canvas barn jacket over a flannel shirt, dark trousers with a crease that had survived the drive, and a pair of work boots that had been resoled at least once. He did not wear a beret. He did not wear unit pins or branch insignia or any of the small visible markers that veterans sometimes accumulate the way other men accumulate golf trophies. The only thing on his person that anyone might have read as military, if they looked closely, which almost no one ever did, was the way he held himself when he stood. Not stiff, not performative, simply vertical in the manner of a man for whom standing correctly had long ago stopped requiring any conscious effort. He was 73 years old. His name was Gordon Alcott, and he sat at his usual spot at the far end of the bar where the counter met the wall, and he could see the door and the room and the photograph wall without moving his head. Cheryl set his rye and water in front of him without being asked. He nodded his thanks and did not speak further. He rarely did. He had been coming to this legion for 11 years, and in that time had told Cheryl very little about himself. She knew he had served. She knew it the way you know certain things about people who have been in your life long enough, not from what they say, but from the texture of how they are. The way he sat, the way he listened to other people's conversations without appearing to, the particular quality of attention that belongs to men who have learned that missing something can cost more than just embarrassment. She knew he had a daughter in Thunder Bay. He called on Sundays. She knew he took his coffee black and his rye with water, and that he was allergic to something in the branch's nachos because he had mentioned it exactly once, apologetically, as if the allergy were a personal failing. She did not know his rank. She did not know his unit. She did not know where he had served, or for how long, or what it had cost him. In 11 years he had never told her, and she had never asked, because she was wise enough to understand that the men who carry the most are often the ones least interested in being asked to set it down on a bar counter for strangers to examine. The man in the canvas jacket arrived at 7:15. He came through the door with the energy of someone entering a room he expected to recognize him, and the room glanced up in the way rooms do when someone unfamiliar arrives, brief, involuntary, and then returned to its business. He was carrying a half-finished rye he must have brought from somewhere else, which Cheryl noted and did not mention, because the evening was early and she was still deciding what kind of problem this man was going to be. He sat at the bar near the center and introduced himself to the man beside him as Kevin, just Kevin, no last name offered, which is not unusual but is the kind of thing Cheryl files away. He said he was passing through, heading west, had stopped in Kenora for the night and seen the Legion sign and thought he'd pay his respects. He said this with an ease that suggested the phrase had been used before, many times in many legions. He ordered a fresh rye, Canadian Club, no ice, and began to involve himself in a conversation that had been going on between two men at the end of the bar without him. The two men were Terence Hollins and Bob McDuff, both in their 60s, both retired, both members of Branch 291 for more than a decade. Terence had done 22 years in the Canadian Army. Signals, had served in Cyprus and Bosnia. Bob had been a corporal in the reserves, 2 years, had not deployed, and was honest about this in the way that distinguishes men who are comfortable with what they actually did from men who are not. They had been talking about the Grey Cup. The stranger inserted himself by mentioning that he had played some football before he enlisted, and that the training had actually helped him in the field, which was an odd bridge to build from the Grey Cup to military service. But he built it with the confidence of a man who does not wait to be invited into conversations. He said he had served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He said he had done 2 tours in Afghanistan, Kandahar 2007 and again in 2009. He said this with the quiet certainty of a man recounting something true, which is a quality that can be performed convincingly enough to fool people who have never heard the real thing. Terence Hollins listened without expression. He was a man who had learned patience the way soldiers learn most things, through repetition and necessity, and his patience now had the specific quality of a man who has decided to let a situation develop on its own terms before he commits to a response. Bob McDuff turned back to his beer. The stranger's confidence expanded as his glass emptied. He talked about Kandahar airfield, about the dust, about the heat, about a specific engagement he described in terms that were vivid and detailed and had the shape of a true story without quite having its texture. He talked about the men in his section with the casual fluency of someone who has studied how soldiers talk about each other, the nicknames, the shorthand, the affectionate contempt. That is the idiom of people who have depended on each other under serious conditions. He talked about a vehicle strike on Highway 1 that he said he'd been in, about the white flash and then nothing, about waking up in the roll 3, about the hearing in his left ear that had never fully come back. He touched his ear when he said this, which was a detail good enough to be convincing to someone who wasn't paying careful attention. But Terence Hollins was paying careful attention. He had been paying careful attention since the second sentence, and what he was hearing had the unmistakable quality of a story assembled from research rather than experience. The details were too consistent, too resolved. Real stories about real things have rougher edges, they trail off, they contradict themselves, they have gaps that the teller skips over, because some parts of a true experience resist being made into a story at all. This man's story had no gaps. It had the smooth, continuous surface of something that had been told and refined and told again until the telling had replaced the event it was supposed to describe. 3 tables away, near the window that looked out onto the side street and the parking lot and the cold October dark, 4 men were sitting with their drinks and had been listening for the past 10 minutes. Their names were Roy Sinclair, Douglas Enright, Pat Haggerty, and Vic LaBelle. Roy was 78, a former corporal with the Royal 22nd Regiment, the Van Doos, who had served in the early days of the Cyprus mission and had come back from it with a knee that never healed correctly and a conviction that the work had been worth doing anyway. Douglas was 67, a former master corporal who had spent 19 years with the Royal Canadian Regiment and done a tour in Bosnia that he described to almost no one. Pat was 64, a former sergeant with the PPCLI, the very regiment the stranger was claiming, who had done one tour in Kandahar in 2006 and come home and started a landscaping business and tried with mixed success to keep the 2 parts of his life from contaminating each other. And Vic was 71, a former warrant officer with the Lord Strathcona's Horse, Royal Canadians, who had been an armoured soldier for 24 years and who drove an hour and a half from Vermilion Bay every Thursday specifically to sit with these men because the drive was worth it, and the alternative was sitting at home in a silence that had no company in it. These 4 men did not need to confer. They had listened long enough to arrive at the same understanding simultaneously, which is a thing that happens when people have enough shared experience to read a situation from the same angle. Pat Haggerty set his glass down. "He's claiming PPCLI Kandahar," he said, quietly enough that only the table heard. 2007 and 2009, Douglas said. "I was 2006, Pat said. "But I know guys from both those rotations." "He's not one of them," Vic said. It was not a question. Roy Sinclair had been looking at the photograph wall while they talked. He turned back to the table. "The detail about the vehicle strike," he said. "Highway 1. He didn't say where on Highway 1. "Because he doesn't know where on Highway 1, Pat said. "Because he read about a vehicle strike and the article didn't say." Douglas nodded. Let him keep talking. They went back to their drinks. At the end of the bar, Gordon Alcott sat with his rye and water and listened. He had heard the stranger's voice carry across the room from the first sentence, and he had listened the way he listened to everything, without appearing to, with the kind of attention that has no performance in it because it was never meant to be seen. He had heard the claims. He had heard the details. He had heard the particular rhythm of the storytelling, the surges of confidence, the places where the narrative accelerated past moments that a man with real experience would have slowed down for, because the moments that cost you something are never the ones you rush through. He had heard all of it, and he had formed his opinion of it within the first 5 minutes, and his opinion had not changed since. He set his glass on the bar and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the stranger. He looked at the ribbon bar on the inside of the jacket lapel. He looked at the way the man was sitting, the way his hands moved when he talked, the way his eyes tracked the room for approval after each significant claim, and then looked back at his rye. He waited. The stranger had found a new audience. 2 younger men, early 30s, civilian, who had come in after supper and were on their second beer and had been drawn into his account of the vehicle strike, the way people are drawn into something when they have no frame of reference to question it. They were leaning forward slightly. One of them, a younger man with a beard and a Northern Ontario Walleye Classic cap, asked about the IED, asked what it felt like. The stranger paused in the way of a performer, not a man returning to a memory, and said that the worst part wasn't the blast. The worst part was the silence after, the way everything went still. The Walleye Classic cap nodded, visibly moved. Across the room, Pat Haggerty said quietly, "He just said he lost hearing in his left ear from the blast. Now he's saying everything went silent after. Those are 2 different things. He doesn't know which one he needs," Vic said. Roy Sinclair was looking at the end of the bar. Gordon Alcott had set down his drink. He was turning on his stool, not quickly, not dramatically. The way a man turns when he has made a decision and there is no reason to hurry, because the decision is already complete. The stool made a small sound on the floor, and in the particular way of small sounds in a room that is paying attention to something, without quite admitting it, the sound carried. The nearest conversations dropped. The droppage spread. By the time Gordon Alcott had fully faced the room, the bar had gone to the kind of quiet that has weight to it, the kind that makes people stop mid-sentence and look around without knowing why. The stranger noticed. He felt the atmosphere shift before he understood why it had shifted, and he looked toward the end of the bar and found the old man looking at him. The old man's expression was not hostile. It was not confrontational. It was simply attentive, the flat, careful attention of someone who has already formed a conclusion and is now taking a moment to confirm it. "Son," Gordon Alcott said. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It had the quality of a sound that doesn't need volume because it carries something in it that volume cannot add. The room went quieter still. The stranger turned on his stool. Something moved behind his eyes. His chin came up a half-inch, a reflex, the instinctive preparation of a man who senses that the ground under his story is about to change. "Yeah," he said, and there was something in the single syllable that was not quite confidence anymore. Gordon Alcott looked at him steadily. He looked at the ribbon bar on the jacket lapel. He looked at the man's face. He was quiet for long enough that the stranger had to resist the urge to fill the silence, and almost didn't resist it, and then the old man spoke. "You said PPCLI? You said Kandahar." "That's right," the stranger said. His voice was even, but his hands, which had been moving freely all evening, had settled onto the bar on either side of his glass, and they were still. "When your section went out on a presence patrol in the Panjwai," Gordon Alcott said, "and you made contact, and you broke contact and pulled back to a rally point. What was the first thing your section commander told you to do when you got there?" The question settled into the room like something dropped from a height. It was, to anyone who had never served, a straightforward question about military procedure. It might have sounded like something you could look up. It might have sounded like the kind of tactical detail you could absorb from a documentary or a memoir, or a conversation with someone who had actually been there, but it was not, because the answer to that question is not a fact. It is a habit. It is something that lives in the body of a soldier who has done it correctly under pressure and incorrectly under pressure, and correctly again until the correction becomes automatic. It is the specific and physical memory of what a section commander's voice sounds like when he is accounting for his people in the seconds after contact, and what you do with your hands and your weapon and your breathing while that is happening, and what the ground feels like under your boots if you're lucky enough to have made it back to the rally point at all. It is not something you learn from reading. It is something you learn from doing it until it stops being a decision and becomes a reflex, and then you learn it again. Because the first time you did it under real pressure, you found out that the reflex was not as solid as the training had made you believe. Every soldier who has been on a presence patrol and made contact and broken contact and found a rally point and stood there while the section commander accounted for his people knows exactly what happens next. They know it the way they know their own name. They do not need to think about it. They do not need to search for it. It comes up from somewhere below conscious thought, like a word you've said 10,000 times. The stranger stared at Gordon Alcott. His mouth opened. It stayed open for a moment that stretched past the point where opening it had been a good idea. What came out was not an answer. It was the beginning of an answer, which is worse than no answer at all, because the beginning of an answer tells you everything about why the rest of it isn't coming. He said, "Well, you," and stopped. He said, "You'd make sure," and stopped again. He said something about weapons and something about calling in, and neither of those things was what Gordon Alcott had asked about. And everyone in the room, old enough to know the difference between what had been asked and what was being offered, understood, with a precision that needed no discussion, exactly what was happening. The silence that followed the stranger's trailing off was not empty. A room full of veterans is never empty when it goes silent. The silence was full of recognition. It was full of 30 people who had served this country in various capacities, in various decades, understanding simultaneously that the man at the bar had never stood at a rally point, had never listened to a section commander account for his people, had never been on a presence patrol anywhere at all. The silence was full of the weight of that understanding, and the particular feeling that comes when something that seemed uncertain is made suddenly and completely certain. Pat Haggerty stood up first. He pushed back his chair at the window table and came to his full height, which was not impressive. In a physical sense, Pat Haggerty being a compact man of average build who looked more like a retired high school teacher than a former infantry sergeant. But he stood with the particular quality of a man who knows exactly where his feet are, and the room recognized it. Roy Sinclair stood next, then Douglas Enright, then Vic LaBelle. 4 men, 4 different regiments, 4 different decades, standing at their table without a word exchanged between them, because no word was necessary. Then Terence Hollins, who had been sitting beside the stranger for the past 40 minutes, stood up from his bar stool. He was not looking at the stranger. He was looking at the photograph wall. Then a man at a table near the stage, a woman in her 60s, with a silver branch pin on her lapel, stood. She had served 20 years as a logistics officer in the Canadian Forces and had come to Branch 291 on Thursday evenings for 6 years, and she stood with a steadiness that made the standing look easy. Then another, then another. Then the 2 men who had been playing pool in the back corner put down their cues and stood, not because they had served, but because they had grown up in this town and they understood what the standing meant. Within 90 seconds, every veteran in the room was on their feet. Not one of them had said anything to the others. Not one of them had moved toward the stranger. They simply stood, the way soldiers stand when something important has been seen and cannot be unseen, and must be acknowledged before it can be released. The stranger's face had changed colour twice in the past 2 minutes. He was gripping his glass. His eyes were moving from face to face with the particular speed of a man looking for a way out of a room that has no exit from itself. He looked at Cheryl Wozniak behind the bar. Cheryl had set down the glass she was wiping and crossed her arms and was looking at him with an expression that was not angry and was not warm, the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is waiting to see if the situation requires her to act on it. Pat Haggerty walked from the window table to the bar, 1 step at a time, unhurried, until he was standing 3 feet from the stranger, with his hands loose at his sides and his voice quiet enough that the room had to stay silent to hear him. "I did a tour with the PPCLI in Kandahar," he said. 2006, I know men from the 2007 rotation and the 2009 rotation. I know them by name, I know what they looked like when they came back, and I know some of them I'm not going to see again. He paused. "I don't know you." The stranger said nothing. He was looking at the bar. "Those ribbons," Pat Haggerty said, glancing at the lapel. "Did you buy those, or did someone give them to you?" No answer. Douglas Enright stepped forward, not threateningly, simply closing the distance by a few feet. And when he spoke, his voice had the measured evenness of a man who has had to deliver difficult information before and has learned that the information is better served by steadiness than by emotion. "Take them off," he said. "Put them on the bar and leave. Nobody's going to follow you out. Nobody's going to do anything other than let you walk out that door. But you're not going to sit here in front of that wall." He nodded toward the photograph wall without taking his eyes off the stranger. "With those on your jacket." The stranger looked at the lapel. He looked at the faces of the men and women standing around him. He looked at the photograph wall, the faces in the frames, the unit crests, the small brass nameplates underneath images of people who had been young once, and in some cases had not had the chance to stop being young, and something happened in his expression that was not comfortable to watch. Not shame, exactly. Something adjacent to shame. The look of a man who has built a self out of borrowed materials for so long that being separated from those materials feels like being separated from something real, even though he knows, in whatever private place he keeps that knowledge, that none of it was ever real. He reached up with 2 fingers and unclipped the ribbon bar from his lapel. It came off small and light in his hand, and he set it on the bar without drama, and the small sound it made on the polished wood was the loudest thing in the room. He stood up. He did not look at anyone. He walked to the door, pushed it open, and went out into the parking lot and the October dark. The door swung shut. The room held its standing for a long moment. Then, one by one, people sat down. Chairs shifted. The pool cues were picked up again at the back. Cheryl Wozniak picked up the ribbon bar and looked at it for a moment, and then set it on the shelf below the till, not in a place of display and not thrown in the garbage, but somewhere in between, which is the correct place for something that is neither honourable nor entirely without meaning. The room settled into the heavy quiet that follows a moment of collective witnessing. The kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable because it is shared, and that passes gradually into something lighter as people remember that there are still drinks in front of them and the evening has not ended. Bob Macduff was the first to speak. He had been sitting at the bar through everything and had not stood up, which he had noticed about himself, and which had made him feel something complicated. And now he turned on his stool and looked down the bar toward Gordon Alcott, who had returned to his rye and water and was sitting the way he had been sitting before, hands on the bar, eyes on his glass. "That question you asked him," Bob said. "The rally point question. How'd you know that would be the one?" The old man looked at him. He seemed to consider whether to answer, and then decided that the evening had already given something, and he could afford to give a little more. "Because it's the kind of thing that lives in the hands," he said, "not the head. Your hands know what to do at a rally point before your brain finishes asking what's happening. If you've been there, the question is almost too simple. If you haven't, no amount of reading gets you there." Bob nodded slowly. "How many times were you there?" Gordon Alcott was quiet for a moment. "More than I'd choose to count," he said. "Fewer than some." It was Pat Haggerty who came to the end of the bar next. He brought his beer and stood beside the old man's stool, not presuming to sit, not closing the distance further than the distance already was. He had noticed in the past weeks the old man's presence at Branch 291, the quiet Thursday evenings, the single drink, the way he sat with the room around him without becoming part of it. He had wondered, but not asked. Now the evening had made asking feel less like intrusion and more like the thing a person with any decency does. "I've seen you here," Pat said. "I didn't want to presume." The old man looked at him. "You were PPCLI," he said. It was not a question. Pat nodded. 2006. Kandahar. "How was Sperwan Gar?" the old man said. It was the name of a former Taliban stronghold, a place that the soldiers of the 2006 rotation knew the way they knew the weight of their kit and the sound of a specific type of incoming, because they had spent weeks in and around it during Operation Medusa, the largest conventional ground offensive that Canadian forces had undertaken since the Korean War, in a stretch of days in September 2006 that the men who survived it carried differently from everything else they had ever done. Pat Haggerty looked at the old man for a long moment. "You know Medusa," he said. "I know some of the people who were in it," the old man said. And then, quietly, "and some of the people who weren't in it anymore when it was over." The bar had gone quiet again, a different quiet this time, respectful, attentive. Roy Sinclair and Douglas Enright and Vic LaBelle had migrated from the window table to the bar, pulling stools, settling without ceremony around the far corner, the way people settle when they understand that something worth listening to is about to be said and they want to be near enough to hear it. The old man did not usually talk this much. Cheryl Wozniak, who had known him for 11 years, would say afterward that the words he said over the next hour were more than she had heard from him in the entire time she had known him, and that she had heard things she would not repeat because they were not hers to repeat, and that she had also heard things she would remember for the rest of her life, because some things, said in certain rooms by certain men at certain moments, are too true to let go of. He told them about signing up at 17, which you couldn't do officially but which happened, if you knew how, in 1968, when the country was a different country in service, meant something that he found difficult to explain to people who hadn't felt the pull of it. Not impossible to explain, just difficult, the way you explain a smell to someone who has never encountered it. He said the closest he could get was that in 1968 the idea of belonging to something larger than yourself had a particular gravity, and he had felt it, and he had responded to it, and he was not sorry he had. He told them about his first posting, Signals, because that's where they put you when you were 17, and came in with aptitude scores that weren't meant to be seen by someone your age. He told them about Germany in the early 70s, NATO, the long grey watch of the Cold War, the particular boredom of standing vigilant against a thing that you hope desperately never comes, and that you are not entirely sure what to do with yourself if it doesn't. He said that boredom in that context is not the same as regular boredom. He said it has weight to it. You carry it differently. He told them, briefly and without detail, about Cyprus in 1974, about the coup and the Turkish invasion and the days that followed, the particular confusion of a peacekeeping mission that was not peacekeeping anymore, of being present in a situation that exceeded its mandate. He said only that some things that happened in that period he had thought about many times since, and that his thinking had not yet resolved them, which was an honest thing to say, and the kind of honesty the room knew how to receive. He told them about later postings, later decades, things he characterized only in outline, not because he was performing modesty, but because some experiences take up the full available space inside a person, and there are not words for all of it, and the parts that have words are often not the parts that matter most. He told them about the last year he served, which was a year he wouldn't name, in a capacity he wouldn't describe, and he said only that when it ended, he had driven back to Ontario and bought the half-ton truck and spent 4 months renovating the kitchen in his house, and that the kitchen was still the best kitchen he had ever been in, and the table he'd built for it was solid maple, and he ate breakfast at it every morning, and some mornings that table was the best thing in his world. Roy Sinclair, who had been listening with his hands around his glass, said, "What do you miss?" The old man thought about it, not performing thought, actually thinking. "The certainty," he said finally, "not of outcomes. Outcomes were never certain, but of purpose, of knowing that the thing in front of you is the thing in front of you, and that doing it correctly matters, and that the men beside you are doing the same calculation, that clarity." He paused. "You trade it in when you come home. Sometimes it takes a while to realize what you've traded." The room was quiet. Douglas Enright was looking at the table. Pat Haggerty was looking at the photograph wall. Vic LaBelle was nodding, the slow, careful nod of a man confirming something he had not had language for until this moment. "That man tonight," the old man said, turning his glass in his hands. He gestured vaguely toward the door. "I'm not angry at him." Several of the men around him looked up. "He wanted something," the old man said. "He wanted to stand somewhere that felt solid. He wanted to walk into a room full of people who had done something real and have them look at him like he was one of them. That's not nothing. That's actually a very human thing to want." He set his glass down. "But the wanting doesn't give you the thing. The doing gives you the thing. And the thing he wanted can't be given anyway. It has to be earned. And the earning is not just the training and not just the deployment. The earning is what it does to you. The weight of it, the carrying of it afterward. That's the thing he thought he could wear on a lapel. And the reason it doesn't work is that it doesn't live on a lapel. It lives somewhere in here." He touched his chest, not his medals, not his heart exactly, somewhere less specific than that. "And you either have it or you don't, and everybody in this room with it knows it when they see someone who doesn't." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that earns itself. Nobody rushed it. It was Cheryl Wozniak who broke it in the only way that felt right, which was by setting a fresh rye and water in front of the old man without being asked and without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Cheryl," he said, "you've never done that before." "I've been thinking about it for a while," she said. "Tonight seemed right." He smiled at her. It was, as smiles go, a restrained thing, because that was the kind of man he was. But it reached his eyes, and his eyes were the kind that had seen enough to make what reached them meaningful. He raised the glass slightly in an acknowledgement that required no words and took a sip. The evening continued the way good evenings at a Legion Hall continue, which is to say the heavy moments settled into something warmer, and the conversation found its way to lighter ground. Stories about bad kit and worse weather and officers whose decisions looked different in retrospect than they had at the time. Roy Sinclair told a story about a vehicle recovery exercise in Germany that ended with a perfectly functional APC in a drainage ditch and 3 people whose paperwork for the incident became, in his words, creative. The room laughed. Even the old man laughed, the quiet, brief laugh of a man who recognizes something true. Near the end of the evening, as coats were being reached for and tabs settled, Pat Haggerty stopped by the old man's stool one final time. "You should come out on the Remembrance Day parade this year," he said. "We march at 10. It's not much by some standards, but this town turns out." The old man considered this. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's what you said about the Thursday evenings," Pat said. "And here you are." The old man looked at him. "That's a fair point," he said. Roy Sinclair, pulling on his coat near the door, said, "We do breakfast after. The Husky on Highway 17. "It's not fancy, I'm not fancy," the old man said. The room moved toward the door in the easy, gradual way of people who are not quite ready to leave, but understand that the evening has come to its natural end. They said good night to Cheryl and to each other and stepped out into the parking lot where their breath fogged in the cold, and the flag above the building moved in a wind off the lake. Gordon Alcott stood up from his stool, steadied himself briefly with one hand on the bar, and collected his jacket from the hook beneath the counter. He buttoned it against the cold that would meet him at the door. He looked around the room, at the bar and the tables and the photograph wall and the people filing out, and he looked at the shelf below the till where the ribbon bar sat, and his expression had in it something that people who have lived long enough to see many things sometimes carry, the particular mixture of sadness and steadiness that comes from knowing that the world contains both what that ribbon bar represented and what the men in those photographs represented, and that the work of being human is partly the work of telling the difference. He tapped the bar once with his knuckle, a small private gesture, the kind of thing you do to mark a moment you do not have words for. He nodded to Cheryl. He walked to the door. Outside, the parking lot was dark except for the floodlight on the flag and the pale rectangles of light falling from the Legion's windows. The air smelled of lake and pine and the particular cold clarity of a northern Ontario night in late October. His breath fogged. His boots were loud on the gravel. He found his truck and opened the door and lowered himself in the way a man lowers himself into a driver's seat when certain parts of him have been through certain things and carry the record of it. He started the engine. The headlights swept across the parking lot, across the pale brick of the Legion building, across the flagpole and the flag moving in the dark, across the sign beside the entrance that read Branch 291, Royal Canadian Legion, and below that, in smaller letters, the words they put on every Legion sign in every town in this country, because there is no better way to say what needs to be, said they served Canada. He sat with the truck idling for a moment and looked at the sign. Then he put it into reverse and backed out onto the side street and drove north toward home. The Legion was still there behind him. The photographs were still there. And the men and women who had stood up without being asked, who had risen from their chairs, without a signal and without discussion, and without any need of either, they were still there, moving through the parking lot in the dark, saying good night to each other in the easy way of people who will see each other again next Thursday. Because that is what they do. They show up, they stand when standing is called for, and then they go home through the northern dark, and they come back the following week, because the showing up is not a performance, and it is not a ceremony. It is simply what duty looks like when no one is watching. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who should hear it, because in a country full of people who take the quiet ones for granted, it matters to stand up for those who stood up for us.